So thank you everybody for joining our Informative Friday sessions. Today we're doing Introduction to File Creation Utility. Just want to make sure that everybody is aware that this session is being recorded. And a quick reminder before we get started, please use the chat feature to ask any questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to try to address those. And at the end, there is a Q&A session as well. A copy of the presentation and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants. If you're not a registrant and you would like a copy, please send me an email and I will include you on that distribution. My email is molly.velasco@nordicglobal.com, and I'll drop that into the chat. Next slide, John. So just wanted to share a quick reminder that Bales is now Nordic. As many of you may know, Nordic Consulting acquired Bales a little over 2 years ago, and this year we changed our name to be Nordic. So just spreading the word that Bales is now Nordic. We continue to do the same great Infor ERP work that we've been known for, all the same familiar faces, just operating under the Nordic brand moving forward. So with that quick reminder, I'm going to turn it over to John, who is presenting today.
All right, welcome everybody. I see we've got a pretty good group. We did this presentation a couple years ago. We've obviously tweaked it a little bit in the last couple of years, but this has always been a very popular topic, especially with anybody that might be looking at sending data from Infor down to S3. So I'm glad that you're here. A little bit about me. Some of you may know me already, but I do live 25 miles north of Minneapolis. So I'm up in a city called Andover, out in the country a little bit, which is exactly what we loved. I've been involved in the Lawson/Infor space since 1998, so that might be longer than some of you on this call have been alive. Hence the gray hair. So that's I've been in this space for a very long time. Since Lawson version 6 is really when I got my start. A fun little hobby of mine is I do enjoy home brewing beer, and I actually use some of the hops that I grow on my property. And so I grow a couple pounds of hops on my property that then we use in the beer that we make. And so it's kind of a fun part of the reason why I fell in love with the land that we bought when we moved a couple years ago. A quick little disclaimer, information provided in this is related to implementing and upgrading to Infor version 11 Cloud Suite. The material and information contained in here is for general information only. Do not solely rely on this information for making business, legal, procedural, or system-related decisions. You don't want to trust me with that much information. Nordic makes no representations or warranties of any kind, expressed or implied, about the accuracy, reliability, suitability, or availability with respect to the information. Any reliance you place on such materials without consultation is therefore strictly at your own risk, and it is highly recommended that you contact Nordic ERP services to make sure the solutions are tailored specifically to your needs. So a little disclaimer there. So what we are going to be talking about is the file creation utility. So this is going to give an overview of the Infor file creation utility functionality and introduce you how it might help simplify some of your file exports. So real quick, high level. So the file creation utility is a delivered utility with HR talent as well as financials and supply management. That part is fairly new, just within the last year or so. They've included it on the financials and supply management side. The FCU allows for the creation of flat files based on mappings to specific data. The generated files can then be used as exports, which is generally what we see people using this for. These files can be quickly and easily created without any coding. So this is something that you could give access to your power users. You do not need to worry about them knowing how to use IPA or any coding. It's a very simple process, and we'll see that throughout this presentation. And then if you want, after you pull that data out, you can then send that data to process flows or ION to do whatever work you want to be done after that data has been pulled out. So we see that very commonly. People will use this as a simple way to pull out the data, kick off an IPA flow that will then take care of moving the file somewhere or doing further logic to the data once it's there. As far as accessing file creation utility, the screenshots you're going to see in here are all talking about the Infor Global HR or the HR talent. You can get to it similarly from the finance and supply management side as well. But one of the roles that you can have is integration architect. And so you're going to access this by going into the integration architect. Then one of your options will be file creation utility and then dashboard. And that's where you're going to see the dashboard for the file creation utility. There is delivered content for HR talent. There is not any delivered content at this time for finance and supply management, but for HR talent, they do deliver a lot of content already. It is not loaded by default. So what you do need to do is click on that delivered content link. It will then show you all of the different contents that they do have available. And if you want to load any of them, you simply just click on load. You will want to check for updates and refresh this if you would like, as they have more. As you can see, I just refreshed this the other day in preparation for this, but this is where you could go through and you can see all of the different contents, the file creation setups that Infor does deliver for you. There are four main components to the file creation utility, and we will be talking about these in the following slides. We've got eligibility groups. These are used to limit what records can be included in the file. Basically, this is going to be what controls whose data or what data do you want to be included in the file. We have our rows. We can have header rows, trailer rows, and multiple detail rows if needed, and you'll see that in one of the examples. We have our columns, and the columns could be literal, business class fields, user fields, and blank values. The user fields is really where the power of this tool comes in, as you may or may not have done enough with Infor version 11 that the user fields are a very powerful part of it now, and you can have user fields on any business class. So you can make those user fields available to be part of the exports from file creation utility as well. And then the fourth component is data mapping. So you can do some data mapping to remap values from an Infor value to any other value. It's a really nice way to be able to do that mapping. And as you'll see, there's a little bit of flexibility with it. So it's something that definitely will make this a more usable tool for you to use. As far as setting up and creating your file creation utility, from the dashboard, you're going to click on Create. And then the very first, when you first get into it, you're only going to see these three tabs. And so in the setup detail here, we're going to go ahead and tell it whatever we want the name to be. And then we're going to select our source file. If you do this drop down, you'll see the list of all of the different business classes that you can pull from. And it is constantly being added to. So it's every now and then with the monthly updates, there will be more source files that will be considered available for this. You'll notice a lot of the source files, like in this example, I have employee, but right underneath that would be employee export. And so the difference between the two is if you select an export file, then records will be automatically created as soon as the export records are created. So if you want something where every time an employee changes some data, by default in Infor, that's going to populate the employee export business class. If you choose that as your source file, that will then start previewing that data and loading it into the file creation utility. If you choose just a regular source file like employee, then there will not be any data in this file until you run preview. So really that comes down to what is the needs that you have and which way would you prefer it to work. Some of the other things that we can do on this initial part here for the setup is we can tell it what we want the file name to be. And then if you would like, you can append a timestamp to the file name, which is wonderful. And with that, you can go ahead and click on this button here to build the timestamp format, and then you can tell it, you can choose what date format you want and what are your options of what you want it to do. Include century, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, whatever you want it to do here. Once you get this part finished, then you're going to click on Save, and that will then enable you to move on further in the setup of your file creation utility. The second tab that we had there was File Attributes and Processing. This is where we're really going to tell it how do we want this file to be taken care of? So the first thing that we've got is our attributes. We can choose it to be a separated file or a fixed length file. So that's a great functionality there, that if whatever the receiving software is that's going to be taking this data, if it needs to be fixed length, you can definitely select that as your type. Most commonly, we're going to be doing a separated file type. We're then going to tell it what the field separator is. This could be anything that you want it to be. Obviously, the most common would be comma or um, exclamation point or something like that as far as that field separator. We can then tell it what we want the end of line character to be. Do we want to use a server default, or is there a certain other type of end of line character? Down under processing. So what this is going to do is it's going to create one large file with all of this data. If you want to, you can change it so that the file segment limit is limited by a number of records or by a certain amount of megabytes. So if there is a need for you to make these files a little bit smaller, instead of it being one large file, you can go ahead and set up that file segment limit, and then it will follow that logic to create multiple files for you. Next, we have the generation behavior for no output. So what do we want this to do if it runs and it doesn't find any data? You'll see further along one of the options that we can do when we set this up, and this is really, I think, where the power of this tool comes in, is you can have it pull all of the data that meets the criteria, or you can just have it pull delta records. And I think that's where we see a lot of people using this tool, is have it run every day, once a week, once a month, and it's only going to pull in data that's changed since the last time this was run. Well, if we're running for delta records, what if nothing changed? What do we want the system to do if there is no output? Some of the options that we have for that is to generate no file record. So basically, don't create anything, just complete and be done. Your other option is it can create the file with the headers, but then no data. Or the third option is it would just create the file, but then it would be 0 byte size because there's no data being put into it. So some of the options that you have to what to have happen if there is no data that comes back. And then the last option you have is your threading method. So by default, this is set up to be single threaded. You could set it up to be multi-threaded, and there's a couple of options inside there if that is needed. Typically, I don't really see that there's been many times where you need to do a multi-thread. Typically, the single threading works just fine, especially if this is a scheduled export that's running. Maybe you're running it overnight. So then at that point in time, you're really not going to be as concerned about async usage. So, but this is where you do have that option to set it as single or multi-threaded. So we've got our eligibility groups, is the first of the 4 categories I had mentioned of the data that we have. So our eligibility group is really what's going to control, as I had mentioned, it's going to control what the criteria is for the records that are going to be included in your export. Do not be alarmed. It's going to have the business class set to work assignment. That's by design. And if you try to change that, you'll see that it's going to be grayed out. That's just by design. Infor has decided that the base business class in the HR talent side is going to be work assignment. And obviously, I'm not Infor. I don't know the reason behind this, but I think it's likely because you can get all of your data either from work assignment or backing up one to the employee and then getting the data. And so the work assignment was a good business class to have as the base, and you can get to all of the data that you need from that. You're then going to have to build your condition of what that criteria is. If you are used to LPL coding, you can just go ahead and type that condition right in. Typically, people like to use the builder because it makes it a lot simpler to use. And so if you click on the build button, it's going to bring you to the condition builder. This is going to be similar to every other condition builder that you'll see inside of HR talent or inside of finance and supply management. We can come in here, and if you know the name of the field, you can just type it in, or you can select the search icon, and then it's going to bring you to a screen that's going to allow you to go through the hierarchy and find the field that it is that you're looking for. Once you select your field, you have your condition. It can be equal to, greater than, less than, not equal to, contains, a lot of different options that we have in the condition. And then what are we, in this case, relationship status equal to, what do I want that value to be? I have two options. I can select the literal button and then type in what that literal value is, or I can have it compare to some other field. If there's some criteria where you want to compare it to some other field, you can use that. One thing to be very careful of here is this value is the actual value of what's stored in the system. That is not what the label description is. So if you were to build a condition and it didn't work for you, one thing you're going to want to do is take a look and see what the actual values are. And in a lot of the fields inside of Infor, which you're probably familiar with, if you go onto that field, do the Control Shift left click, it's going to pop up a screen that's going to tell you all the information as far as business class, field name, type of field. But there's going to also then be a link to, for some of them, of what the values are. So if it's something that's got a drop-down list, for instance, you can look and see what the actual values are that are stored in the system. That might help you figure out why your condition wasn't working. Another nice thing that you can do with the condition is you can do and or for the conditions. So if we want to do an and, we're going to select up at the top to match all. And then if I click on build another, it's going to bring me another line with an and in there. Or if it's an or condition, it would be a match any, and this and would be replaced with or. So this is a really easy way with the builder to be able to build our conditions, as complicated as we need them to be, to figure out what that criteria is for inclusion in this file. Once you select that condition, you'll come back, you'll click on save. I'm sorry, once you build that condition, you'll come back to this screen here, and this is where you'll see the condition as you built it. So this is where, if you knew the LPL, you just go ahead and type it right in here if you wanted to, instead of hitting the builder. A very important part that sometimes gets missed: once you create this custom group, we then have to associate it with the subject. So once you hit save, it's then going to give you the ability to do this custom group subjects on the bottom. And your custom group subject is always going to be HCM group file creation, then the name of your business class. So my business class that I'm based off is employee, and so the subject group that I'm going to select is HCM group file creation employee. This is the piece that connects this custom group with being available for use in my file creation utility. Once I get this done, I go ahead and exit this screen and then select that group from my list of eligibility groups. And then that will fill out that part. So now we've done our work of telling the system what is the data that we want to come in. What's the eligibility rules for being part of this export? Once we do that, now we need to create our rows. What are the rows that we want? And in this example that I've got here, a very simple export. So our very first row is our header. And so we're actually going to have that in there as a row type. We're going to have our row type as a header. Then we're going to create a couple of detail rows. And so what we can do is we can set up conditions for the row if we want, and we can have one-to-many as well as source files. So in this example, my second row is going to be employee data coming in. That data is going to be coming straight from the employee business class. So the row type is a source file. But then my third row of data that I want is dependent data. I want information on any of the dependents that my employee has. Well, that would be a one-to-many relationship, because obviously there could be multiple dependents for each employee. So when I create this one, it's not going to be a source file, but it's going to be a one-to-many. And when I set up this row, I'm then going to tell it which business class, and again, it knows from its logic what the one-to-many relationships are from employee. One of those is dependent, so I'm going to go ahead and select that as my third row. So this is where you're going to build depending on what you need, what your requirements are. We're going to simply tell the system what are our rows that we're going to have. After our rows, we're now going to go ahead and create our columns. And so this is where we're going to have the details of each of our columns. And this screenshot here shows for the header row. And so in this example, real simple, my 4 columns are going to be employee number, dependent type, first name and last name. That's all we're doing in this example. So obviously, since this is a header row, all of these are going to be a literal input. It's not pulling the data from anywhere in the system. I'm giving it the literal value of what I want it to be. And so that's where the field name, and then the literal value will be the value of that field name. So this is where I tell it, this is what I've got for each of my different columns. Next, I'm going to select the employee row. And now I'm going to tell it what I want it to do, what I want the data to be for each of the columns in this employee row. One thing that's very important is you want to make sure that you're following the same columns in every one of your rows. The system isn't going to force you to do that. So if you were to forget one of the columns, or if you were to get them in the different order, file creation utility is simply going to do what you set it up to do. There is no logic in there to make sure that each of the columns are the same for each of the rows. But in this example, we've got employee number is my first column. When I go through and set up the details of the column, I'm going to have in there where I'm going to tell the system what kind of data is this. Is it numeric? Is it alpha? And again, if you don't know if that data coming out of the system is going to be numeric or alpha or date, again, you can go to that field in the application, go to a form that has that data in it, highlight that field, do the Control-Shift left click, pop up that screen, and that will show you what the data type is going to be. You want to match that data type here in your export. So for employee number, we're going to go ahead and set that as numeric. As far as input options, we've got a couple of options. So we can do a blank, we can do a literal, a field required, or a field optional. So what this is going to tell the system is I'm going to tell it here that employee number is a required field. If it does not find a value in that field, then this export is going to fail. So if it is something that is required that there's data in here, then I'm going to go ahead and set up that input option as field required. I'm going to select which business class I want it to be. So again, employee is our source business class. And so that's the business class that we're pulling this data from. I could use any of the related business classes as well if I wanted to. And then I tell it what source field I want to use as the data coming in. So again, I know that that's employee is the name of that field. In this example, our second column is dependent type. Well, obviously dependent type doesn't apply to my employee row, but I want these columns to all line up. And so in an example like that, my input option would be blank. So it's just going to, dependent type's just going to be a blank data coming out. My third and fourth columns are first name, last name. Those are alpha fields. Again, they're going to be required fields. And then here's the source fields for each of those. So this is how I build out my employee row. Last, I come down to my third row, my dependent row. So here, the very first field we have is employee number again. And this is where I can come in here and it's a one-to-many relationship, but I want to use my source business class of employee. So I'm not going to pull employee number out of the dependent business class. I want to go back to the employee business class and get that data. So I can do that and bring in that employee field. For my dependent type, last name, first name, I want these to be alpha fields required. And these are coming out of that dependent business class that I set this up to use. And then these are the source fields that I'm going to use. So this is the building of each of the rows and each of the columns. Once this is done, so I've told the system how I want the data to come in, I may have a situation where I need to do data mapping. So data mapping is where for that column, so as you can see here in this example, the column is our dependent type is what we're using. I'm going to use this to change the value of the data. And so we specify our specific scenarios. We can use multiple compare types, and then we set up a default matching as a catch-all at the end. So in this example, from Infor, our values that we have as our possible dependent types: child, daughter, dependent, domestic partner, non-tax qualified spouse. What we want in the export is we don't want it to have those as the values. We want it to be values 0, 1 through 4 in these scenarios. So this is where I set up that data mapping. It's just a simple data mapping. If the value is child coming from the system, change it to a 0, 1. Description is just a description to help me figure out what I want. Do that for each of my scenarios, and then at the very end, I'm going to have nothing for my from value. I'm going to give it a to value, and then actually here's a problem. Here's a mistake in the screenshot I just caught right now. This default mapping should say yes. So that's a mistake here. I apologize about that. But this is where you would set this default mapping to a yes. Then what the system is going to do is it's just going to work its way down here with every record for the dependent type, and it's going to check, do any of these match? If not, then I'm going to use this default one as a catch-all. Once you get everything all set and created, and we've got our file creation set up the way that we want it, next what we can do is we can actually generate preview records before it actually creates the file for us. So these preview records create the records for the export, but they're still inside the system. We haven't created our output file yet. You can select the option to generate the file automatically after the preview if desired. Typically, once you've looked at it a couple of times and you see that it's working the way that you want, that's something that you're going to do, and you'll see that on the next screen. One very important catch is you need to make sure that your file creation utility is active. So on the Setup Detail tab, at the very top, you're going to have this active field. You want to make sure that that is selected to active. By default, once you set this up and create it, it is not going to be active. You need to come out here, click active to make it an active export. Then you will have the option up here to generate preview records. Once you tell it to generate the preview records, it is going to bring in for you if you have multiple organizations, you'll select which organization you want to use. If you only have one organization, it's going to bring that value in. This is coming from your actor context, and it's not going to give you the option to change it if you only have one organization. And then file creation setup, this is just which file creation number it is that's in your system. And then if you want, this is where you can check the box to generate the file after creating the preview records. So if you wanted to go ahead and create the previews and then right away go ahead and create the file, then you can just go ahead and select this option. From here, you could submit it or you could schedule it. So once you've tested it a couple of times and it's working the way that you want it to work, you can go ahead and come in here, set it as schedule, and then just like any other schedule job, you can go ahead and tell it the frequency and when it is that you want it to run. If you did not choose to have the file generated after the preview records are created, then one of your options up at the top of the screen is going to be to generate the file. So we have the ability to generate the preview records. And then if I did that, and there are some preview records sitting out there, then I can come out here and I can select the option to generate the file. So again, then what you do is you would click on generate file to submit, and then click the submit button. It would then take the data that's in the preview records and create the file. One nice thing about doing it in 2 steps like this, especially at the beginning, is if you have it create the preview records, you could then look in. One of the options that you'll see in the file creation setup is to view preview records. You can go in there and you can see some of the data that it's pulling back, and then that way you can take a look at it and you can determine if it created the data the way that you want before creating the file. Once you've got it to the point where it's running the way that you like it, then you can just have it go ahead and create the file automatically so that you don't have that additional step. Schedule it to run overnight. Then you're going to have your file that was created. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the options down here in the bottom of processing in our file attributes and processing section is we can select an IPA flow, or we can automatically send the file to ION. So if your requirements are to do one of the two, you'd simply come down here and select which process flow you want it to run, or you would select this button here and it would automatically send the file to ION, and then you could have things set up inside of Ion to grab that data and do whatever it is that you needed to do inside of Ion. As far as exporting and importing these, so you create this in your test tenant, you want to move it into your prod tenant as an example. How do I go about exporting my FCU setup? So from your list of setups, you would select the one or multiple setups that you want to be exporting. You click on the ellipsis and then select export setup. Once you do that, you're going to have options for what you want the separator to be inside of the file that gets created. Pipe, caret, double pipe, double caret. So in this example, I've just got double caret as a separator, because you're not going to want the separator to be the same separator of what you have inside the file. So hence why we've got the double pipes, double carets, and things of that sort as our options. Once you run the export and it's complete, one of the options that you're going to have up at the top tab here is mapping export. If you click on this mapping export tab, you're then going to see your setup export as a TXT file. And then you can simply click on the link and download that file, save it wherever it is that you want to be saving it. And then as far as importing it, it's as simple as get to your destination tenant, go to your file creation utility, you see your setups. You're going to click on the ellipsis. You're going to select import setup. Then what you're going to have is an option then to tell it which organization you want this file creation utility to be associated with, where the file is. Do you want it to create a new one, or is it updating an existing? What was the separator that was put inside of that file? And then what is the end of line character that is on there? Then you would just click save or submit, and then it will go ahead and import that file creation utility into your new environment or your new tenant for you. There's very good documentation. If you're not familiar with docs.infor.com, I highly recommend that you spend time out at that website. There's a lot of very good documentation, both from a functional side as well as a technical side. As far as where you can find the data that really does a really good job of explaining how to use this tool. For HR talent, inside of docs.infor.com, you're going to go to People, HR Talent. And then inside of there, you are going to select the Infor HR Talent Integrations Library, Cloud and On-Premises. And you're going to notice there's going to be a little lock icon next to that. You do have to log in to Infor Concierge in order to download that document. And then inside of that document, you're going to find this information inside of the third-party integrations section. For finance and supply management, inside of docs.infor.com, you're going to select ERP and finance, then financials and supply management. And then again, the document in this case is going to be Infor Financials and Supply Management Integrations Library, Cloud and On-Premises. Again, there's going to be a lock icon next to it. Inside of that document, the section that you're going to want to go to is third-party integrations. So strongly recommend that you go out there, get used to going out to that site, look there. There's going to be a lot of really good documentation in there for you to help with everything that's going on and with setting these up and running them and things of that sort. What do we have for any questions?
There's no questions in the chat right now. I'll just pause in case anybody wants to come off mute and ask questions. Okay, so getting a few. Do you know if the FCU setups are part of data copies between tenants?
My understanding is that they are not part of the data copy. And so that is why you will want to go through that export and import steps to make sure that you bring them and move them from one to the other. That's my understanding. I could be wrong, but I believe recently for one of our clients, they did a data copy and this was not part of it. So,
Okay, next question. Ryan is saying you might have missed it, but where do you set a file name if you schedule this to deposit in a folder?
yes, so the file name is actually in the uh, one of the very beginning parts is when we had the processing and attributes. And so that's where you would tell it the file name, and then you can go ahead and tell it uh, what kind of a timestamp you want after the file name if you want. And then just by default, what this is going to do is it's just going to create that file for you, and you'll be able to, in fact, if I just back up a couple slides, I don't have a screenshot of it, but inside here in this files tab on the top is where you will see, if you were to click on this, you would then see a list of all of your files. And this is where you would then click on the file to download it. And so that's why if you want the file to go somewhere automatically, you're going to want to link it to a process flow or link it to Ion and then have that take care of it. I've done that before where I've just set up a real easy process flow that takes that data. If you tie it to the flow, it will load that data right into the flow and then just simply FTP the file out to put it somewhere.
Okay, and then Cindy was wondering, can we use custom fields from the business class?
Yes, so you can use user fields. So any user field that you associate with the business class, that user field should show up as one of the available fields to use then for the export.
Okay, next question. Can we get at audit log data through the file creation utility?
I know that I've had this question before. I don't think you can because that data is not directly associated with the business class. That is definitely something that I can look up and get back to you and let you know, but I do not believe you can get audit log data out of this. You can have it create Delta files so that it only brings in changed files, but I don't think we can pull any data out of that audit log.
Lance, if you wanted to drop in your email, we'll be sure to follow up with that for you. We did have some pre-submitted questions, but I think you covered all of those in your presentation. So I think we're
Okay.
good there. Anybody else with questions? Oh, one more came in. Can you direct a field to reference a cross-reference table, or is it limited to the data mapping?
It is only limited to the data mapping. Unfortunately, it won't reference cross-reference mapping that you can set up for other exports. So yeah, so if you can build the data mapping within that data mapping screen, then you're good. You'll be able to go. But if you need something more detailed than that, then this tool would not work for you.
Okay. Feel free to keep asking questions, but we'll go ahead and cover the rest of the slides, and I'll let you know if anything drops in.
All right.
So thanks everybody for joining. As always, we have our Coffee with Consultants offering, and it's a complimentary 30 minutes with one of our expert consultants. You can reach out at nordicglobal.com/contact to schedule that. We encourage that if you have any further questions or related to file creation utility that we can help with, or even anything else on the product. And then I believe the next slide is just our upcoming sessions on the 18th, Infor's new open enrollment, and on the 25th, inventory replenishment using mobile supply chain. So if you're not already registered, you can go out to Work Out Loud and register, or you can send me an email at molly.velasco@nordicglobal.com. Just a reminder, we do these sessions on a quarterly basis. So our next quarterly session will be in October. And that is it. We don't have any more questions. So if anybody thinks of anything, feel free to also send an email and I can follow up with John and get back to you. But thanks everybody for joining us on a Friday. Thank you, John, for a great presentation. Very informative.
Thank you very much. Enjoy everybody's weekend.
Thank you.